I've got a very heavy message to share with you guys, but I think it's one that is absolutely necessary, one that's absolutely vital to share. It goes as this. Now, the prophet Isaiah described him as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Jesus, the Son of God, is a man deeply grieved and entrenched in pain. We say we want to be like Jesus, but do we truly? He was a man in complete sorrow and felt a lot of pain. Likewise, the prophet Jeremiah, who was referred to as the weeping prophet. Do you know why? It's because he said if his eyes were a fountain, they would never cease flowing for the disobedience of his people towards God. Now, W.B. Yeats referred to him as a friend of sorrow, who bore the pain of God unmatched by any other prophet in the Bible. Before Jeremiah came Nehemiah, who was a man in a position of authority. He was in another country, but his heart was in Jerusalem. Now, when he found out about the ruin in Jerusalem, and if you haven't read Nehemiah, I think you need to stop what you're doing and read that Bible, read that book immediately. Because when he found out about the ruin in Jerusalem and how the walls were broken down, how many were still in captivity, and how many people preferred to be in captivity, he wept. Now, the exact word used in the scriptures, depending on the version, was mourned. And that word is extremely impactful, because when you hear it, you immediately think death. When we hear the word mourn, we associate it with death and burial. Nehemiah mourned to God as though his people had died or were dying. He felt the pain of death and loss, that when God decided to use him, God himself saw a man that experienced a tiny fraction, a tiny semblance of what he had felt for many years for his people, mankind. In essence, Nehemiah felt God's pain, just like Jeremiah did, and even Jesus did. Now, we always go to God with our problems. We love that song, roll your burdens on the Lord, for he cares. But like Ravenhill said, who does God roll his burdens on? God's heart is heavy for the sin of this world. I believe his heart is even heavier for the state of the so-called church of God, who is naked, blind, and miserable, like the Laodicean church in Revelation chapter 3. I believe the church is a heartache to God. It was his love for this world that made him offer up his own son for crucifixion. Now, if you don't grab the gravity, the seriousness of that, you're lost. He loved the world so much that he gave his only son up for shame, for crucifixion. If you knew a man who gave up his own son to save something, you had better believe that man loves that thing deeply to put it before his own son. We would know that man's heart by his sacrifice. God's heart is still for this world. It is not his plan for anyone to perish. Now, that isn't just a verse, a phrase to cheer us up, to make us feel good. It's not God's will that any man should perish. How many of us have the heart of God? Do we feel the pain of God for a dying world and a church incapable of making inroads into the problem? If not, it's because we are not truly seeking God's heart. If we don't feel that pain, we're not seeking his heart. Because if we did, we would see pain there. We're still living for ourselves. Many of us are still living by works. We still think if we just pray, if we go to church and live a godly life, we are fine. But I can bet my life there isn't one single person in the scripture who lived a life like that. And definitely not Jesus. He lived for the people, fulfilling God's plan, disrupting the religious norms, showcasing what it is to be a servant, interacting with sinners and those in society who society despised. He offered them a lifeline of love. If Jesus were here, would he be living life like you are? He definitely wouldn't be living life like I am. We need to know the heart of God. When we read his word, when we look at the world we're living in, it's clear to see how God's heart must be feeling. When we look at the inaction and ineffectiveness of the church, I truly think we would weep to God. You know, we hear about people raping and killing children and we say, oh, this world, what has it come to? If we feel like that, how much more God? God saw that Jeremiah and Nehemiah were feeling what he felt, and he used them. God's burden was upon them. And I believe we should be praying for pray to God, what is your burden for me in life? Not what is my next career ambition or who's going to be my husband. Those things are important, I get it. But they come very low on the list in comparison to this. What is your burden for me in life? I beg of you, make that prayer today.